Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Suzanne, we're good to go.
Good. Bonjour à tous. Ce matin, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a very unique and special webinar, Glimpses of Light from the Bottom of a Pit. Quite a title. I'm very happy to welcome today Richard Abulafia, Vice President Analysis at Teal Group Corporation, who is a leading figure of the aerospace industry. We are extremely pleased to have him with us this morning. Richard manages consulting projects for clients in the commercial and military aircraft field and has advised numerous aerospace companies. He also writes and edits Teal's World Military and Civil Aircraft Briefing, a forecasting tool covering over 135 aircraft programs and markets. He also writes publicly about the aviation field with numerous articles in Aviation Week, Aerospace America, and other publications. Frequently cited as an aviation industry authority by trade and news publication, he has appeared on numerous television news and programs and has spoken at a wide variety of conferences, including a few with us at the Aerospace Innovation Forum. Richard, once again, thank you. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We are deeply honored. But before we proceed with our speaker, I will ask Kevin de la Roseville, to walk us through the technical details of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. So yes, at the end of the webinar, there will be a question and answer period from 15 to 20 minutes with Richard Abulafia. So to ask your questions, please click on clavardage or chat at the bottom of your screen and send your questions in writing to everyone or to the host of the webinar. Now, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Melanie. It's really a pleasure to be here, but of course, and bonjour. It's a real pleasure, but I got to say, it's a bit of a heartbreaker because I remember when this terrible pandemic began, the next trip I was going to take was to Montreal for Aéro Montréal. And as always, I had every moment of my schedule planned out, you know, up to my favorite restaurants in the plateau. And oh boy, it was a real heartbreaker when the pandemic hit and I wasn't able to go. And anyway, I miss you, Montreal. I guess that's the upshot there. But it's a thrill to be on. Thanks so much for coming and listening. I'm here to spend the next hour with you explaining what my colleagues and I are seeing in this rather unexpected development in our world industry. So with that, next page, please, Kevin. Thank you. First of all, the picture to the right, fun fact, I think it was about 3 years ago, I spent the summer with my family in Nova Scotia, which sadly wouldn't be possible this summer. So I'm in Cape Cod, which is exactly parallel with Nova Scotia. But the zoo there is I believe the town is in Wolfburg, Wolfville. It's right across from Halifax, and it is a lovely zoo. And for the first time in my life, I was privileged to see black swans. Every economist loves black swans because, of course, they're a metaphor for something unexpected. And I remember I took my camera out while my family looked on and said, you know, I'd better take their picture. I might need it one day. And here we are. And well, there's my picture of the black swans in the Nova Scotia Zoo. Unfortunately, I should have taken a picture of more than 2 of them because right now we're dealing with a whole bunch of black swans. We've got, of course, the pandemic. We've got the associated economic downturn in the aftermath. There's also a fuel price shock that we're slightly recovering from. There was already a bit of a de-link between air passenger traffic demand and economics, even in the run-up, especially in China. And China is another black swan. You know, you follow the headlines. These are very difficult times for Chinese Western relations. And of course, what's happening in Hong Kong is absolutely not promising anything good. And of course, China is the biggest single market outside of the US for jetliners. Matter of fact, it's tied with the US for jetliners. So that's another black swan. I wish I had taken a picture of all of them. I don't remember how many there were, but I should have gotten all of them. Now, what's going on this time, this downturn relative to others? I get that question a lot. So do all my colleagues. And I thought I'd summarize that for you. The good news is, and I promise to end my presentation with more good news. I'm going to begin and end with a little bit of good news with a lot of unpleasantness in between, I'm afraid. First of all, going into this crisis, airlines were far healthier than in any other crisis. Everyone was, well, all the big carriers were in pretty good shape compared to where they'd been, say, back in 2002 or any of the ones before. Now, what's not so good is that last time we did have the ability to stimulate demand in the world economy with cheaper cash, lower interest rates. We can't really do that. We'll have a little bit of that, but not much. On the positive side, more good news, the financial system is intact. So you compare this with 2008, when nobody could, well, it was hard to get money. It was hard to get letters of credit. It was hard to arrange third-party financing for jets in many cases. It was a financial system meltdown. We don't have that. Strangely, the broader economy is not in good shape, but the financial system is fine. No one can figure that out. I think the US has been at the center of that. You know, I know people who are losing their jobs. You know, a lot of stores are closed, restaurants are closed, but my 401k is fine. My retirement fund is fine. Wall Street is fine. It's strange, but it's oddly good news for us. A big thing we wrestle with moving forward, how much state aid will be provided. Obviously, the airlines are fine until, in the US, October 1st. I think Canada is something similar, if memory serves. A lot of the other countries have some kind of protection program. But if demand doesn't come back by then, that's a real problem. And then finally, the long-term impact on this business. That's something we think about. R&D budgets are going to get hit first. What's that going to mean for new product development and everything else? This is a really big issue moving forward. So these are the big issues to sort of frame the crisis, and of course to look at my picture of black swans. So let's look at some numbers. Next page, please. Thanks. Here's where we were moving into this crisis. As you can see, single-aisle jetliners are the biggest single segment of the aviation business, where they had been. You know, it was depressed last year. That 2018 to 2019, negative 24% that you can see in the upmost right-hand part of the graph, of the chart, that was purely due to the MAX. That was not a market problem. Twin-aisle jets, just below that, growth had slowed a lot. For a variety of reasons that I'll walk you through. Regionals have never been a great place. Business aircraft, that's a funny one. We were just seeing some traction in 2019. I know that's near and dear to Montreal's heart because of, because of what they do at Bombardier up there. That 17% growth, however, the bulk of it was purely due to the Global 7500 and the Gulfstream 500, 600. All three of those were ramping up, and that improved things. Rotorcraft were doing well, but some of that is a bit of an illusion. The military rotorcraft, that was merely due to the comeback in Apaches at Boeing. All told, 2019, a fine year from a market standpoint, not a good year from an industry standpoint because of the MAX problem. Now, if you were a subcontractor on the MAX, you might not have felt this because these are deliveries and not production. Production actually was somewhat higher. It's just that the 450 MAXs that were built were not delivered. Next page, please, Kevin. So what are we thinking moving forward? You know, it's funny, in about the time that my trip to Montreal was canceled, sadly, my colleagues and I sat down and thought, all right, what's going to happen? What's going on here? And we came up with this, and I wouldn't change a word. I think we got it right. Well, we'll see what happens in a year. We could be completely wrong, but so far, I think we were onto something. The thing that gets hit most is twin-aisle jetliners. because international traffic is going to get hit hardest and for the longest time. When you finally are willing and able to fly again, you're going to go somewhere domestic. You're not going to take that dream trip to Italy. You already had an overcapacity situation with twin aisles. You'll see that in a moment. And then on top of that, everyone is retooling with a single aisle when they can. They're retiring older twin aisles, A330s, 777s, and replacing them with, well, most of the time an A321. So you already had a shift towards single aisles. Single aisles, though, are going to get hit. We all know this, but not as badly as twin aisles. A lot depends upon fuel. A lot depends upon China. You'll see in a moment, China had already come down. We don't know. Good news is things weren't as bad as they could have been, because we could have been higher up in deliveries if the MAX had kept going. And if Airbus had gotten to where it wanted to be, well, you'd have a bigger come down from that higher point. Business jets get hit the third most, but we don't know how much, right? I mean, it's amazing how much business jet utilization has already come back. Jet transport demand is still down 80-something%, but business jet demand, business jet flying is only down about 25 or 30% at this point. It's made a nice recovery. So this might not happen. You'll see in a moment that the bigger iron, the Bombardiers and Gulfstreams, are closely connected with oil prices, so a lot depends on oil prices. Civil rotorcraft, they'll get hit because of the oil and gas demand fall off, but we don't know how much. This might not be bad. And then last, military programs. This is your safe haven as a supplier. Military programs are going to be in the safest place. We haven't changed our military numbers at all. If anything, you could see an upside. Not a bad situation with military programs. Matter of fact, it's about the strongest bright spot on the horizon. Next page, please, Kevin. Thank you. Brief history of the commercial jetliner market going back to 1958, start of the jet age, at least the non-British start of the jet age. And it had always been a cyclical market. We'd always had 7 good years, 3 bad years, 7 good years, 3 bad years. But in 2004, we started growing and we didn't stop until the MAX problem. So between 2004 and 2018, it was a remarkable story of growth. The 2019 downturn, that little fish hook you can see there on the right side, that was purely due to the MAX. That had nothing to do with the market, well, until now, 2020. But we were on an amazing 15-year tier there. It was incredible. So the good news here, if you read into it, is we're in a much higher place as an industry than we were during the last downturn. You can see there, 2001 to 2003. So when Airbus talks about numbers dropping 35, 40%, that's probably accurate, we think. We'll see, might be slightly worse, but even then, the bottom of this trough is still going to be higher than the previous peak. So we're a much bigger industry. We've got a bit more protection. That ultimately is good. Next page, please. Okay, this is not a chart I had ever been prepared to show anybody. It's really strange from our good friends at IATA who do really good work. They think it's going to be a 55% decline this year. I don't know. The number for April and May, as you can see there, May just came out yesterday. They did that just for you, just for this presentation. Came out yesterday. Thank you, IATA. And you can see a tiny, tiny glimpse. There's the theme of my presentation here. There's the glimpse of light from the bottom of the pit. We hit 94% down, and I think now we're only 90% down. Slight recovery. And that's the blue line there at the bottom, revenue passenger kilometer demand. We would need a really very strong recovery to get to a 55% decline in 2020. I would look for IATA to revise that downward. I think reality is going to be more like 65 or 70% down this year. We've never seen anything like this ever. This is, again, not something I'd ever expect to show anybody. There are people older than me. Yes, there are. I've been doing this for 33 years. I know a guy who's been doing it for 55 years. And when this started, I said, what do you think? And he said, well, I thought I'd lived long enough to see everything, but apparently I hadn't. And apparently we hadn't. Next page, please, Kevin. Thank you. So you can see on the right side, the history of air traffic. And we talked about downturns before. The worst we'd ever seen is down 3% in a year. After 9/11, after 2008, after 1991, down 3%, that was the worst. And here we're talking 55, more likely 65, 70. Paul Krugman, the great economics writer, said the world economy is in a medically induced coma. Our industry has been in a medically induced coma. That's accurate. Now, traffic recovery, determined by the virus. More on that in a moment. Backlogs are holding up. Does that mean anything? No, not really. You know, only 1% of that January backlog is canceled, but over a third have deferred. That's what happens in these downturns. People defer all at once, and they've got the contractual right to defer. Obviously, Max is most at risk for obvious reasons. People who have Max contracts have a greater, because of the delays, have a greater ability to get out of those contracts, to get out of those commitments. A lot of early retirements coming, mostly twin aisles, 777s, A330s. If there's an A340 out there, wave goodbye. The A380 is going to be a bloodbath. The last ones are coming off the line. They will probably be parted out in a couple of years. These planes are born to die, as they say. That's kind of sad, I guess. After years of not liking that plane, now I almost feel a degree of pity for it. It's going to be the only aircraft with a lifespan of a couple of years. From an aftermarket standpoint, this is your greatest area of concern as an industry supplier. Because, you know, you start with that traffic downturn to calculate aftermarket demand. Then you factor in the availability of used and serviceable material from retirements. And then on top of that, you have destocking at the airlines who build down their inventories, work down their inventories, rather than order new parts. This year is going to be a shock to aftermarket demand. It's probably going to be 75% down. That's devastating. And it's companies that are most dependent upon aftermarket that are going to feel the worst effects of this crisis. Now, military aftermarket is going to be exactly the same as it was. So from a supplier standpoint, military exposure to the aftermarket is going to help. But if your company is 90% commercial aftermarket, this is going to be the worst year you'll ever experience, ever, period. Next page, please, Kevin. So we, of course, have our famous Dr. Fauci. At least maybe he's famous. I don't know outside the US. But those of us in America who are looking for leadership, not seeing a lot of it, but looking for leadership, Dr. Fauci has been a voice of leadership. And he had a great quote. He said, "You don't make the timeline, the virus makes the timeline." So when we talk about people's willingness to fly, that purely depends upon the coronavirus, absolutely nothing else. So when we calculate our assumptions for this crisis, we start with the assumption that people need a vaccine before they're comfortable flying. And that's going to take 18 months and then another year to administer it, take effect. We don't think you get back to 2019 air travel demand, the peak, until 2023. I think that's a reasonable scenario. So we're not looking at a V-shaped recovery here. And it's more like, as people say, either a U or a Nike swoosh, to use a corporate logo. It's going to take a lot of time. And until then, well, this will be like nothing else we've ever experienced. Next page, please, Kevin. Now, one of the key drivers behind jet transport demand is the ratio between interest rates and oil prices. What you want is a very healthy spread. You want cheap cash to buy new jets and expensive fuel as a reason to buy new jets. Well, the good news is that cash is getting even cheaper because central banks throughout the world are lowering interest rates. The bad news is we don't know what's going on with fuel. You had that weird couple of weeks back in, I believe, March or April, where they were paying you to take fuel. The fuel comeback has been fantastic, but it's still in the 30s. We need for it to be above 50 for a really healthy market again. That would be good, but we don't know where things are headed. Next page, please. China is the other thing to watch. The problems in China, not just the relations between China and the West, but also China as a market, those began well before the pandemic. You saw air travel demand grow in China in 2018 at 12.2%. 2019, it fell to 5.3% by the end of the year. And look what happened to jetliner exports to China. It had been an incredible ride up. China was 2% of the world market 20 years ago. By 2018, they were 23% of the world market, tied with the US. And in 2019, that got cut in half. And even before the pandemic, 2020 was scheduled to be about the same. Something bad was going on with China's economy that they weren't talking about. I suspect this might be coloring their relations with the West, and perhaps even what's going on in Hong Kong right now. This is very concerning because, again, it's our biggest single export market outside the US. Next page, please, Kevin. Looking at book-to-bill ratios for large jetliner orders, well, book-to-bill is no longer a thing, I'm afraid. We'd had amazing years where the ratio of orders to deliveries was 2 or 3 to 1. It's going to be negative orders this year. We're, I believe, at about negative 200 or 300 so far this year. Net, we've made the assumption we'll get to negative 650, I think, in this chart. Who knows, right? And again, it doesn't really matter. Backlogs are going to stay reasonably okay. Not that many people cancel. Cancellations are more a function of airlines going out of business, which hopefully won't happen too much. You'll see bankruptcies, but not people exiting the industry too much. But in terms of us getting back to a healthy level of orders, that's more like a 2022 story. The next year and so are going to be pretty bad from an order standpoint. Next page, please. Here's our expectation of the jetliner market moving forward. The green line is twin aisle jet output. The red line is single aisle jet output. And the regional line is blue, below. Regionals never really went anywhere. Why did Bombardier want to get out of that? By doing the A220 and selling the CRJ and the Dash 8? Well, it's that line. They saw the future, it wasn't good. And of course they bet on the C series, which, well, that was perhaps a bit too much of a bet of the future. But at least they knew the market trends. Green line had seen an amazing rise in 2011 to 2015. And we're now stuck with a lot of capacity. And again, international traffic is going to be hit the hardest and longest. And on top of that, people are, well, replacing twins with singles whenever and wherever they can. So we don't see a twin aisle peak recovery until after our forecast period. Single aisles are a different story. Look at that. You had that big dive in 2019 with the MAX production suspension, but you get a pretty quick recovery. Why is that? Part of it is that going from 0 to 20 per month on the MAX, which will happen hopefully sometime later this year or early next year, that's going from something to nothing to something. That's good. And not only that, but they had built 450 jets in Renton that they hadn't delivered, so they weren't captured in these numbers. You'll see those delivered in 2021, 2022. So you've got a really strong recovery there, taking us back to the peak in 2023 or 2024, or beyond in 2024, really. So single aisles, they're going to make a stronger recovery than twins. The problem is a lot of that's going to benefit Airbus. More on that in a moment. Next page, please. And here it is. The number one trend in jetliner demand that we can see, talking to airlines, talking to clients, is that if you're an airline and you can replace an older jet with an aircraft that has the same range or better range, the same economics or better economics, and fewer seats, you do it. You absolutely do it. What is that good for? Well, it's really good for A220s, formerly C-Series, of course, because replacing a 150-seater with a 130 or a 110-seater that has great range and great economics, that's great. But even more so, the 321, that is very simply the big winner here. It's going to take a while before anybody is a winner in a difficult market like this. But, you know, in a world of losers, the 321 is the least loser and the A220 is the least loser. The 321 benefits because when you take out a 330 or a 777 or a 767 or a 300 or a 310 and replace it with a 321, you get a really nice uptick in economics. Now, what would be really good for Boeing is to develop some kind of new mid-sized airplane, but they're not. Very simply, this is what, this is one of the great second order effects of the downturn. Boeing is cutting R&D. They're going to lose market share unless they do something in that middle segment. And with a single aisle jet that can compete or outmatch an A321, they're going to lose that market. Now, the E-jet should be doing better, and the E175 will do really well because it's the only regional jet on the market now that Bombardier is no longer building regional jets and Mitsubishi doesn't seem to know what it's going to do. But the E190, 195, it's going to be really tough to match Airbus's supply chain power that it will have on the A220. Airbus is, in addition to the availability of cash, Airbus brings to the C-Series A220 the ability to control costs with the supply chain and get the price down, and they've been doing that. Embraer just isn't going to have that muscle, even though the E-jet is a really good product. Large jets, 777Xs, A350-1000s, it's going to be a long time before people want a large aircraft. Next page, please. Here's where we are in backlogs, and you can really see the start of the pandemic having an impact here. Airbus is in red. By the way, you can see Bombardier at the end of 2017 with the C-Series cruelly snuffed out in 2018 when Airbus took it over. But look at what happened in the first quarter. This is as of March 31st. Boeing was taking a hit. Cancellations of the MAX and whatever else. Airbus is doing it right. And that's the 321 and 220. Pure and simple. Next page, please. You can really see that here. In the small segment, less than 150 seats, Airbus is massively ahead with the 220. Slide over, or a section over, you've got the single aisle segment, 150 seats. Well, the MAX 8, believe it or not, is doing okay. Aside from the cancellations, people were mostly keeping the faith. And then you've got twin aisles to the right. Boeing and Airbus are roughly tied. Boeing is slightly ahead in the big segment, but people don't want a big plane. But look at that middle market, 200 seat single aisle, 200 to 240 seat single aisle. Everyone wants an A321neo. This is extraordinary. No one saw this coming. I certainly didn't. And frankly, the MAX 9 and 10, they're good planes, but they just don't have the capabilities. Next page, please. The result, if Boeing does nothing, then Airbus gets first place. This is the result. We've broken out A321neo demand. You can see that in the pink slice at the top, on top of the rest of Airbus. And Airbus gets to 55 or 60% unless Boeing does something. Now, a lot can happen in the next 10 years with new product development. But in the here and now, Airbus is nicely ahead because of the A321neo and the 220. Next page, please. Now, obviously, there's the disaster of, well, I think maybe the disaster for both sides The end of the Embraer joint venture with Boeing. Winner, Airbus and the C Series A220. Maybe Mitsubishi, unless they decide to exit. No one can figure out what's going on with Mitsubishi. They appear to be on the cusp of being the only other 75-seat producer in the world. And now they're cutting funding, and it's hard to tell. And they've acquired Bombardier CRJ unit, which now they have a great support operation for a plane that doesn't really exist, and they appear to be backpedaling on. This is a complete baffler to me. Part of me hopes this isn't just one of those very diplomatic ways of exiting. I can't quite figure it out. I can't tell whether Boeing is a winner or a loser. They got $4 billion in liquidity by not doing the deal, but Airbus gets that 100 to 130 seat segment. Who are the losers? Well, Embraer, big jets, but the 175 is in really good shape, so don't worry about Embraer. Big questions for the regional market. Viking. What's going to happen to Viking? Dash 8's a great plane. Are they going to stick with it? Are they going to have the bandwidth? Will there be a new ATR in a few years? Don't know. We don't think so, but there could be. Will there be an E3, an Embraer turboprop? Doesn't look like it now. They've shelved the program, but it could be. Another big question, how much aid is Embraer going to get? Because Airbus is going to get aid. Boeing is going to be offered, has been offered aid. They'll probably be forced to take it eventually. Will Embraer get equivalent aid? So what's Embraer going to do? We don't know. They'll be okay on their own, but it's going to be really hard for them to grow the way they had been growing. Next page, please. Here's what the regional map looks like. It's pretty flat. Embraer wins most of it, but that's only because, rather arbitrarily, we have the A220 in the big jet section. It's simply too capable to put into regionals. Next page, please. Turning now to business aircraft, I've never seen so much confusion and noise. You know, you've got three very mixed leading market indicators. You look back at the history of the business jet market, and it's driven by corporate profits, equities markets, and oil prices. So corporate profits are really bad worldwide. Equities markets are really good. Oil prices, that's really bad. They're low. So that's not good because a lot of large cabin demand for business aircraft is in resource-rich economies and for companies engaged in resource extraction. Together, that's about 40–45% of demand. So that's really a problem. And then on top of that, we don't know what's going on in the market. Deliveries are way down. First quarter down 26%, but a lot of that could be the pandemic, right? That could be people not able to take delivery of jets. Aircraft available for sale, you know, it's pretty good news. You compare it to the last downturn when the number of people, or the number of jets for sale went up to 20% of the fleet. Now it's only like 9. That's not bad. It's good news. Aircraft prices are down, but not too badly down. Company layoffs, that isn't good, especially, you know, the big three there, GD, Bombardier, and Textron. That's not good. Utilization, it was very badly down, but like I said, it's recovering a lot faster than airline travel. That's good. That implies a substitution effect. That implies that for obvious reasons, people are choosing when they can afford it to, well, fly private, not have to go through a crowded terminal. You know, I would if I could, right? That implies there might be even an upside for business aircraft. It's too early to know. Next page, please. Here's that correlation chart going back 30-something years between oil prices and large cabin deliveries. Oil prices coming way down. Will large cabin business jets follow? We don't know. They certainly did back in 2015. We've modeled in a bit of a downturn, you'll see in a moment, but not a terrible one. Next page, please. Here you can see that the top lines are for the two main segments of the business jet industry. The maroon line was where we thought things were going in January. The red line below it is where we think things are going now. The blue line, that's where we thought things were going in the small and mid-sized cabin section in January, and the green line is where things are going now. So the market takes a hit, but not nearly as bad as what's going on in commercial jet transport. Next page, please. Here are the manufacturers and how they're doing. And the good news is Bombardier and Gulfstream are still tied for #1. The bad news from Montreal's standpoint is Bombardier is pure play. They're the only pure play business jet company in the world. They don't have a defense side. They don't have anything that would give them any protection if there's a serious downturn. And on top of that, they've got a lot of debt. So Bombardier stays up there, but there's a lot of risk moving forward. Bombardier, solid company, very solid products, but they took on so much debt. They've sold everything to help pay it off, but they're still stuck with a lot of debt. You know, the A220 is still the strange, or the C series is still the strangest story I've seen in 30-something years of aviation, where you knew the company was basically almost taking a suicide pill to collect on an insurance policy or something. They only pulled through to me, it's miraculous they've survived, but there's still a lot of risk moving forward. Next page, please. Kind of a funny quirk after all these years of hating each other. And remember that great Canada-Brazil trade complaint back in the early 2000s. These companies would do great together. I mean, the only overlap is between the Challenger 350 and the legacy, the Praetor 600. Other than that, this is the best merger that will never happen. The idea of Bombardier and Embraer getting together and being a really great global aircraft producer, third biggest in the world. Maybe they can put aside history, maybe they can put aside politics and make it happen, but I seriously doubt it. Still, it's kind of a funny quirk in the business, I guess you could say. Next page, please. Turning now to defense, oh boy, you know, like I said, our only safe haven. The US military demand is ramping up nicely. This also includes exports. At the top, you've got the new bomber, the B-21, F-35 in the red area, of course, lots of F-35s. But, you know, the legacy jets aren't dying too. F-A-18 there at the bottom, F-15 still doing strong, F-16 another decade. You know, 5 years ago, I said Canada needed to make a decision or it wouldn't have a decision to make. It's no longer true. Canada, take as long as you like. All the production lines will still be available for when you make that decision. And the same is true for European choices for the next Canadian fighter jet. Next page, please. It looks like Eurofighter will still be around for Canada. They want to go down that route, or Rafale or Gripen, they'll be around. The world fighter market is a lot stickier from a producer standpoint than I think a lot of people predicted. So European demand is pretty solid over the next few years. Long run, look at that after 2025 part of the chart. They've got structural issues. They need to develop new combat aircraft. That explains FCAS in France and Germany and Tempest in Britain. They'll probably be able to pull something off, but they're going to go through a difficult period starting at around 2030 until the new equipment comes online and into production, which you saw back about 20 years ago. It was exactly the same phenomenon. Europe's military producers are used to these kind of big ups and big downs. Next page, please. Rotorcraft, you know, the US military programs ramped way up over the last decade. They're coming down. International military is more stable. Civil, taking a bit of a hit, but it'll be back. Next page, please. Here's what we're expecting in the world market for aircraft this year and next year. As our British cousins say, 2020 is going to be a dog's breakfast of a year. Really bad, a lot of red ink. The good news is in 2021, we think we'll get back to black, which is where we want to be. The bad news is almost all of it is either the MAX or the F-35. MAX, you can see there at the top. Again, you go from rate 0 to rate 20, and you deliver 450 jets that had been built but not put into service. You're going to get good numbers, right? And then F-35, well, there are a bunch of planes that'll be delivered because of delivered late because of the pandemic, and that drives growth in 2021. So the industry somehow grows in 2021, but it's really only 2 programs. You know, the broader industry still is in a very difficult spot, and you can see that elsewhere. Next page, please, Kevin. Here's our roadmap moving forward. Military line at the bottom, wouldn't touch it. May even be an upside because frankly, for a lot of people in legislatures in the US and Europe, it's a good stimulus package. That blue line is great. The civil line, not so much. If I had the pleasure of addressing you in Aéro Montréal in April without the pandemic, I would have shown you that red maroon line at the top and I would have said, happy numbers, good times. Let's all go to drink at my favorite bar on the plateau. Which by the way is a place called the Majestic. I really like the Majestic. However, we're not going to do that. We didn't do that. Instead, we've got that green line valley. Very unpleasant. We'll get back there. We will recover, but it's going to be a few years and we're going to go through this difficult period. Next page, please. Like I said, I promised to finish with good news before I turn back over to the good people of Aéro Montréal to orchestrate any questions. You look hard enough, and again, there are a couple glimpses of light as you stare up from the bottom of our industry pit. First of all, it's a bigger industry than the last time, like I said. So that's good. I mean, there's more cushion between us and the ground. It's also a funny quirk. It's the weirdest thing. If you were to ask an airline economist right now, you'd say, you know, airlines are living in a paradise, except for the traffic. You know, yes, nobody is flying, but fuel is as cheap as it's ever going to be. Jets are as cheap as they're ever going to be. There's no upward pressure on crew costs, no pilot shortage. Interest rates are as low as they're going to be. There's government support. So when traffic comes back, airlines can either stimulate traffic with lower prices or restore profit by maintaining a line on prices. This is good as long as people fly again. And when we have a vaccine, I'm very confident that they will. I'm very pleased to be talking to you via Zoom, but frankly, this sort of thing, it just isn't the same. I think a lot of my colleagues feel the same way. You know, we'd spent all these years wondering whether, you know, better telecommunications was going to suppress demand for passenger travel. Never happened. And I just don't see it happening now because I can't wait to travel again. More good news, defense budgets, they're really good compared to the last downturn. And again, the financial sector is very strong. So third-party finance for jets, not a problem at all. Also, you know, business jets, they've kept a really good line on discipline this time around. You're not seeing the frothiness, the irrationality that you saw with order books, with production rates, and with and financing in the business jet industry that you saw back in 2007, 2008. Things are more disciplined this time. That's good. And then finally, my confident hope, my confident prediction. I think we're going to come out of this as an industry, as a world, realizing that we're more interdependent than ever, not just in a social sense, but in an economic sense. My confident hope is that every political trend that we've been hobbled with for the past few years, whether it's in my country or whether it's in Britain or in other countries, maybe that'll go away and people will replace trade wars with trade peace. Anyway, I really hope that's one lesson that comes out of this. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you for your time. I'm going to turn back over to my colleagues at Aéro Montréal to take any questions from you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for this great and complete presentation. Suzanne, you want to say something?
Yes, I just want to thank you, Richard, and for letting us on a more positive note. My question to you, I have a quick question to you. It's about the supply chain, the SMEs who are really suffering, you know, in terms of cash flows right now. Do you think the ecosystem and the supply chain is really threatened? The smaller firm, do you have that on your radar?
Absolutely. It's one of the biggest issues here. You know, it's a funny quirk of America that the the broader government doesn't consider industrial policy very much, but the Department of Defense does. And the Department of Defense continues to regard smaller suppliers as the most at risk and the place that they're quicker, that they've been keen to accelerate payments to. I don't know whether there's a similar scheme in Canada. I would hope there is or would be, because from a national defense standpoint, it's hugely important. But, you know, what do we look at when we look at the smaller suppliers? One is their exposure to commercial relative to military. The other is what their access to capital is. Third is to what extent they're exposed to commercial aftermarket, which is the most, like I said, the most devastating part of the business. Talking with people, it's an unpleasant reality. Most seem to view 20% as the number. 20% of suppliers are not going to be with us in their current form in 3 or 4 years. That's very sad. I would hope this would take place in an orderly way. You don't want restructuring at the point of a gun, as they say. So I think this has to be first and foremost on the minds of government policymakers. How do you stabilize the small supplier network? Because any supply chain is only as strong as the smallest link. This has got to be the highest priority for everybody. Now, the only other thing I'll say that's positive is that this time around, the financial networks are intact. It's not like 2008, which means private equity can help with mergers and acquisitions. And I think that's going to be a feature of the landscape. Again, I hope in a very orderly way.
Good. So thank you very much again, Richard. I think, Kevin, we have some questions for Richard, or
Yes, that's correct.
you manage that part?
Yes,
please?
so Charbel, could you please read the first question received through the chat?
Yeah, sure. What would be the critical success factors and threats for an effective recovery of the industry?
Yeah, you know, good question. It's hard to avoid that elephant in the corner, which is passenger traffic, right? I mean, that's the most organic source of demand. Let's assume, though, for a moment, that that's not an issue, that it comes back like that Nike swoosh, like that we have another couple of years, in which case it's all about access to capital. And that's why the #1 trend you're seeing in the US and Canada, in Europe, is people getting out there and loading their revolvers, as they say, you know, making sure they have access to as much capital as possible. That is a critical success factor. Sometimes it has to come from primes. If you're a supplier, maybe you need loan guarantees. Maybe it's from the government, maybe it's from the primes who are determined to back you. You know, we have one of our very biggest suppliers, Spirit Aerosystems. They're getting help from Boeing because Boeing has no choice, right? And I think a lot of companies are going to be called upon, a lot of the prime companies are going to be called upon to help. So I regard access to capital as the single most important factor other than passenger travel demand. Another is increasing exposure to defense. If you don't have that much, or if you want to get more, do your best through, you know, whatever, mergers, acquisitions, got to increase your defense exposure. You know, my favorite anecdote, it's the weirdest thing. Just before this really hit, the United Technologies and Raytheon Corporation merger, oh my God, it happened just as all of this was hitting. So basically, as we joke, you had a lot of really happy faces in Hartford at UTC, and a lot of maybe not so happy faces in Boston, in Waltham, Massachusetts, where Raytheon is located, I believe. So basically, keep your portfolio as diverse as possible with as much exposure on the defense side. Great question. That's the answer, best of my ability.
Thank you. Based on your comments, you mentioned Boeing, you mentioned diversification. So I have a few questions with respect to that. So speaking of Boeing, what should be the priority for them, FSA or NMA?
Yeah, you know, it's tough for Boeing. Financially, they were not in great shape before this because of the MAX situation. That's a $25 billion story. Their debt, they've moved to, you know, increased debt. They've taken out another $14 billion a month ago. Their sovereign debt, I believe, is now the same as New Zealand. I'm not making that up. Now, how do you cope given that reality, given that difficult financial reality and the need to keep your cash? Well, they have cut R&D spending by 25%. That's the opposite of what they should be doing. They need to be telling people they're serious about the middle market competing with Airbus. Can they or can't they? So you've got two very contradictory indicators here for the answer to that question. One is do something in the middle market, and the other is stop spending because you need your cash. And we're going to see, in my ideal world, they tell everybody that, yes, we need to preserve cash now, but it's going to be a different story in 18 months. Keep the faith. We are aggressive about that middle market, and we're aggressive about keeping engineers and designers to make that new jet. I haven't heard that from them. I really want to hear that from them. So it might, the answer to the question might be just better messaging and communicating that, because we're not hearing it.
Thank you. Do you think that passengers might be sick and tired of crossing the pond on a narrow body, slow flying A320 or A321 instead of a twin aisle like the 777 or 787?
Well, it's, you know, it's an interesting one. Twin aisles have never really had, sorry, single aisles have never really had a great deal of appeal for transatlantic, but I can tell you the route options are amazing. I remember years ago when Continental, remember them, started up a route from Newark to Berlin. And I used to go to Berlin all the time in the before times. And the idea of going straight shot from Newark to Berlin was great. Yes, you got on board, it was a 757, and nobody likes 757s. But I don't care, it was direct, and it was reasonably priced. So I guess the answer is, it's something airlines have to keep an eye on, but I think if people are like me anyway, and my friends, they're going to say convenience and price are better than equipment choice.
Thank you. Looking at other markets, what is the status of the Chinese programs? Do you see or anticipate a shift to buy more made in China planes and less foreign orders?
Yeah, great question. And here I'll throw in an advertisement. If you go to my website, it's free actually. It's not really an advertisement, but www.richardabulafia.com. I just wrote a column in Aviation Week. This is the top of the things there. And if you go back to, I think, November, I have a piece in Foreign Policy magazine that also talks about this. And I'll quickly summarize my thesis, which is that we were wrong about China. They don't want to be a global competitor. They're not going to be a global competitor. They are preparing an industry for a future in which there's decoupling between China and the West. And unfortunately, the biggest single geopolitical trend you can identify right now is decoupling between China and the West. And you know what? As the US, as Canada, as Britain and Australia move to take refugees from Hong Kong, that decoupling is going to get a lot worse. And I think they're going to want to signal their displeasure by not ordering Airbuses and Boeings, and instead order from COMAC. COMAC will be the equivalent of Ilyushin and Tupolev for the new Soviet economy of the new China. This is the most nightmarish scenario that I can think of in the world. I love China. I'd been, I remember going there for the first time 30 years ago and loving it and watching what's happening in Hong Kong and in relations between China, Britain, Australia, the US and Canada and other Western countries is probably the biggest heartbreak I've ever seen. So that's the long answer, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Any chance to see Embraer back in Boeing arms? If not, what's the future for Embraer?
Yeah, that's the funny thing, right? I mean, Embraer and Boeing, they kind of belong together. I thought it worked. But right now it seems to have fallen apart with a great deal of anger. Now, that doesn't mean they can't get back together, but I don't see it. If you go to my website, again, advertisement for something free, I think about a month ago, I wrote a column in Forbes that you can find towards the top of my website, talking about Embraer's options. I think they could do sort of whether or not China. My final thesis is no, China's not going to do it. Airbus obviously won't. You might see alliances with more alliances with Saab, with Dassault, I love the idea of merging with Bombardier, but you know, that just isn't happening. It's just a quirk, like I said. But remember, Embraer will be fine on their own. It's an incredibly good company. They're really good at what they do. They just won't have the opportunities they would have had with a larger, being part of something larger.
Thank you. What is your opinion on the measures put in place by IATA to reassure the passengers? Are they sufficient to protect the passengers? Are they realistic?
Yeah, I hope so. You know, people are going to see what they want to see, right? And my biggest issue here is that it is from IATA, or it is from ICAO, or it is from all of the government regulators, because the world I don't want to see is where people compete on safety. And the worst moment of this whole thing going, I forget which US airline, but they announced probably the stupidest thing I ever heard in this business, which was, we are teaming with Clorox bleach to offer, it's just, no, do not compete on safety and hygiene. We are all in this together. This is not something to be advertised. So I think we need to keep our ranks together as an industry worldwide to say, here's what we are doing together to keep things safe. And I think that will stand the greatest chance of, well, yes, as you asked, passengers keeping the faith and believing that the system will be okay. Now, a lot of it comes down to social trust. And for some stupid reason in America, at least, it's become an issue whether you wear a mask or not. That has to be enforced. You know, in other words, enforcement plays a key role here too. So I'm hoping the answer is yes, but I really hope that we keep ranks closed and rely on government regulators to make sure that everything is done together.
Just received a sub question regarding Embraer. What about Leonardo teaming with them for a new regional? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, I mean, that's not a bad idea at all, right? The problem with Leonardo is, you know, they've been sort of moving away from regionals. They got involved with Superjet. That wasn't a happy experience, right? Now, they would also have to say, in order to make Embraer's turboprop dreams come true, that E3 would be happening with ATR. You can't rule that out because, look, the ATR product is 35 years old at this point, 35 years old. So if they were to say, we're working with Embraer on an E3, on jets, whatever, you know, maybe that, you can't rule out Leonardo. It's not a bad, you know, I like the idea. It's just that they seem to have been moving in different directions and also retrenching in general, just not as aggressive abroad. Still, it's an intriguing thought.
Thank you. Maybe just one last question. You used the metaphor of the patient on a medical coma. So to reuse that, is the support announced by the various jurisdictions sufficient? Or is handing too much public money in the industry only keeping a dying patient alive?
That's just a great question. You know, we call it D-Day over here in the US. October 1st is D-Day, because that's when the Paycheck Protection Program schemes run out for airlines. And if you don't have demand back more than a couple percent in October 1st, there is absolute disaster. And I think from what I've seen in a lot of other places, that's true too. In other words, I don't believe you're going to see the recovery in demand that we really need to not require further support. So my hope is that, well, I don't like it from a debt standpoint, but I think it might be necessary to provide extension packages to this aid through the winter. And in the US, that'll probably happen over here because we've got an election, right? And when there's an election, people do provide cash because they don't want mass unemployment. Will it happen in Europe, Canada, elsewhere? I don't know, but I would argue it needs to happen. It's a great question. We just don't know.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you everyone for all your questions. Richard, Suzanne had to leave due to technical problems, so I'm going to wrap up for her. So on her behalf and on behalf of Aéro Montréal, we just want to say thank you very, very much for being with us today. We have learned a lot about the current situation and what we can expect in our sector moving forward. So again, thank you very much, and we look forward to having you again with us in the months to come.
Merci beaucoup, and all the best to all. Stay safe and stay sane. Thank you so much for hosting.
Thank you. Have a good day.